Indiana football is 2-0, but they are never satisfied. Welcome back to IU Sports Sunday. Nick Rodecap with you from the WGCL studios in Bloomington. It is a brisk early September morning, which I feel like I certainly have never had the opportunity to say prior to this year. It's been unseasonably cool in Bloomington, although, as we know, those of us who have had the opportunity to experience Bloomington in the fall are aware that it is fantastic, comfortable. The city itself is beautiful, and it helps when the football team is winning because Memorial Stadium is packed. And things are certainly trending in that direction, although as the calendar hasn't flipped to October yet, I don't really consider it to be fall. Indiana comes away with a 56-9 win over Kennesaw State yesterday at Memorial Stadium, and it must be said the attendance, really as expected, was not as good as some people would like. Specifically, I'm sure, the athletic department and IU football fans who think that every home game should be sold out. But this is, I would say, the consequence of Indiana not facing world beaters or even somewhat threatening competition in the non-conference schedule. And that's a talking point that a lot of people have discussed quite a bit, not just during the season, but in the lead up to the season as well. And I'm sure it will continue to be discussed. But I think Indiana needed this game, did the Hoosiers, to continue to find rhythm. And that was one of the things Curt Cignetti said. You're thinking 56-9. Well, the second teamers were probably in by the third quarter, right? And you would be wrong. Indiana left its first teamers out there, both offensive and defensive, until the fourth quarter. And Curt Cignetti made a very good point as to why after the game. He said that game reps, live reps are critical because this is a team that still has a lot of new faces. And as Cignetti said, they haven't executed as a unit for an extended period of time as well as they need to. So that's why Cignetti chose to leave quarterback Fernando Mendoza and company on the field, even as the game was evidently in hand. At one point, it was 49-9 in the fourth quarter with the starters on the field after E.J. Williams caught his first touchdown pass since Trevor Lawrence was his quarterback at Clemson. We'll get into all of that and more, but Indiana now 2-0 on the season after falling in the AP poll following a victory, which is something that's very hard to do. I think that in itself should kind of be an accomplishment of sorts, that you can win a game and lose spots in the AP poll, not only lose spots in the poll, but but remain behind Alabama somehow. That's interesting, but at the same time, not surprising, given what we know to be true about the way AP voters think, and that's why I don't put too much stock in the AP poll. But Indiana, a very complete performance yesterday, much better all around than it played in Week 1's somewhat uninspiring and sloppy win over Old Dominion. 27-14 was the final in that one. Kennesaw State did not find the end zone at all yesterday. Indiana holding the Owls to just 3 field goals. But there were still some causes for concern on defense. It seemed like there were a lot of chunk plays, especially later on in the game, for Kennesaw State. And sure, it didn't necessarily amount to touchdowns, but there were multiple plays over 15 yards, a couple passing plays north of 30 yards that set up those field goals. And I think that's something Indiana is going to have to iron out moving forward sooner rather than later. I mean, you've got Indiana State coming to Bloomington on Friday, and then Illinois comes into town in less than 2 weeks' time. Indiana's secondary is very thin, and I think that's part of why you saw the poor execution on a lot of those deep passing plays from Kennesaw State, especially when the Owls went up-tempo. And Curt Cignetti talked about that as well yesterday. He talked about how, he had spoken throughout the week about how Kennesaw State is an up-tempo team. And when teams get moving really fast or at warp speed, as he described Kennesaw State, they can get you out of rhythm. They can get you somewhat disheveled on defense. Kennesaw State also spreading the field with their formations. A lot of interesting sets, a lot of unique sets, and Cignetti kind of emphasized that just like last week, Indiana's defense was facing a somewhat unconventional offensive scheme in Kennesaw State, just like it did with Old Dominion 8 days ago. And now you've got questions to answer in the secondary with Bryson Bonds being out for the season. Cignetti announced on Monday that Bonds will miss the rest of the year with a knee injury. And also Byron Baldwin was questionable for yesterday, and he was ultimately ruled out before the game per the injury report. There's also the looming conclusion to Lewis Moore's court case, which determines whether or not he has any eligibility left to compete in the 2025 season. That verdict coming down this week, so we will know going into Indiana State whether or not Lewis Moore can play for the rest of the season, and that is potentially another big loss for Indiana's secondary because Moore has had interceptions in each of the first 2 games for Indiana, and that was one thing the Hoosiers did really well yesterday, was paying off 2 turnovers with 14 points. The offense was much more efficient in the red zone, scoring touchdowns every single time they got down there, as opposed to Old Dominion, where Indiana scored just 4 times in 7 trips, and only 2 of those were touchdowns. So, very encouraging progress if you're an Indiana fan, seeing the way the Hoosiers marched down the field and took advantage of the opportunities that they had in the red zone, and they had plenty of them, winning 56-9 over Kennesaw State yesterday. I got to say, as a Tom Allen experience sufferer, I was disappointed to not see more Dexter Williams from Kennesaw State. The Owls benched him after just a couple of drives. And, I mean, he had 1 completion for -1 net yards, to not do anything on the ground. So, sure, he wasn't doing much, but I think you've got to at least give him more time to get settled in, because Williams was named the starting quarterback for Kennesaw State. He didn't do great against Wake Forest, and their head coach, the Kennesaw State Owls head coach, was talking about how Williams needed to execute better in the passing game after week 1. But if you're only going to give him 2 drives in week 2 against a talented defense like Indiana, then I'm not sure that's giving him a fair shake. Ultimately, Amari Odom, Kennesaw State's backup quarterback, showed flashes, 10 of 16 for 176 and a pick. Odom also 11 rushes for 5 net yards, I should say, on the ground. But there were some moments where Kennesaw State took big swaths of yardage out of the Indiana defense. Once again, for a second consecutive game, it seemed like Mikhail Kamara really was a non-factor in the pass rush. He did pick up a sack and a couple of tackles for loss, but the big names for Indiana defensively, Kellen Wyatt, Aiden Fisher, and then, of course, Lewis Moore with that interception. Also, Jamari Sharp with a peanut punch, a Charles Tillman-esque forced fumble and recovery, but after he got beaten on 3rd and long, he did a good job of recovering and stripping the football out and forcing the first of 2 Indiana turnovers defensively. But still, the secondary is very thin, and I'm sure that if, say, the Indiana star freshman in the secondary, Byron Baldwin Jr., is not able to get back healthy for Illinois, Luke Altmaier and company are going to be quite excited about that. So it's something to keep an eye on, because it's clear that Indiana's secondary is the weakest position group. I wouldn't just say on defense, but on the entire roster, be it offense or defense. It seems like Indiana's offensive line is fantastic. Fernando Mendoza spoke highly of them yesterday. The receiving core, as we know, is very deep. Elijah Surratt got involved much more yesterday than he did in week 1. And Mendoza was happy to get him a number of targets. Surratt, 9 receptions, 3 of which were touchdown catches. Surratt matching his career high in touchdown catches. The running back room, as we saw once again yesterday, 300-plus yards on the ground for Indiana for the 2nd consecutive week, which I'm sure has not been done many times in Indiana football history. I don't know exactly how many times it's happened, but to have that complete of a rushing performance, Lee Beebe had 11 carries for 90 yards and a touchdown. Omar Cooper, a 75-yard end-around touchdown after he had previously been escorted to the locker room with a trainer and he was limping off the field. But Omar Cooper seemingly was feeling pretty good on that run, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Roman Hemby, 9 carries for 64 yards, and Kalen Black, 10 for 59. So all three of Indiana's first-team running backs, Beebe, Hemby, and Black, averaging 5.5 yards per carry or better. That is extremely efficient. And if Indiana can establish the run early in games against better teams, I mean, it sounds like coach speak, but if you can put defenses on their heels and say, hey, you've got to be wary of the run, I think that's going to open things up even more for Fernando Mendoza. And the Cuban Missile had a fantastic performance that really the box score does not tell the whole story of yesterday. Mendoza finished 18 of 25 for 245 yards and 4 touchdowns. He did not take a sack. He did not throw an interception. And I think there was some shakiness on the receiving side for Indiana. There were 3 or 4 drops to go into Fernando Mendoza's completion totals. So really, and I know SEC football discourse is usually centered around hypotheticals, but there is a world where Fernando Mendoza was 21 of 25 for around 300 yards. And that's about as efficient as you can ask for. One of those throws was also a throwaway. So Fernando Mendoza, all told, looked much, much more in rhythm. He and his receivers looked much more in sync than they did last week against Old Dominion, which should not come as a surprise to anybody, I don't think, because, well, when you get a week's worth of tape to go back and look at, you know where you need to improve. You've got some practice reps that you can tailor around that. And then you go out there, and sure, Kennesaw State's defense will not be anywhere close to the best Indiana sees this season. I'll be the first to acknowledge that. But it was good to see Fernando Mendoza seeming to start to get settled in a little bit running the Indiana offense, because it's tough when you're coming in and you're playing with a bunch of guys, save for Jonathan Brady, the wide receiver and return specialist who also transferred over from Cal. You're playing alongside a bunch of guys who you've never played alongside in a game before prior to last week. So good to see Fernando Mendoza get settled in for Indiana behind center. It would have helped him if his receivers didn't have multiple drops. But again, I think that is something that's going to come with time, because Fernando Mendoza can really spin it. When you're down on the field before the game watching him throw, you can't hear the zip. It's not like a baseball, but you can definitely tell that he puts a lot on those throws. And I don't know that Curtis Rourke was that much of a thrower. I don't know that he had as much of a fastball as Fernando Mendoza does. I feel like just from memory, from watching Indiana in person, it seemed like Curtis Rourke was really good at fluttering the ball into places where only his receivers can catch it. And Mendoza showed flashes of that yesterday as well. And he was still very humble after the game when we talked to him. I think that's one of the things that I've noticed just through 2 weeks of post-game interviews with Fernando Mendoza, the Cal transfer quarterback, leading Indiana in its 56-9 win over Kennesaw State yesterday. I think that's one of the things that I've noticed about Mendoza is he is very quick to give others around him credit. And I think that's a fantastic quality to have in a quarterback and in a leader. And, you know, it sounds cliche, it sounds media trained, but you want a guy leading you, if you're Indiana, who knows that it takes a full team for him to accomplish what he does. And he talked about how he's got a bunch of talented athletes around him in the receiver room. It's just his job to get them the ball and let them do the rest. And he made an interesting comparison, especially given that we are a basketball state here in Indiana. Fernando Mendoza is saying that he just wants to be the point guard of the offense. So maybe trying to get himself on the good side of Indiana basketball fans as well, which is pretty cool to see. But Mendoza's absolutely right, and he looked great as Indiana's point guard yesterday, making some really good throws downfield. Elijah Surratt was seemingly always open. I wonder if there's a nickname or something that he got because of that. EJ Williams also getting involved, catching his first touchdown pass since 2020, believe it or not. But Surratt and EJ Williams, the only first-teamers with multiple receptions. A very complete performance by Indiana. Curt Cignetti said they made the improvements that they needed to make, but he is not satisfied. Neither are the players. A short week coming up as Indiana gets set to host Indiana State on Friday at 6:30. We'll talk more IU football after this. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday on WGCL. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotacap with you on another brisk Sunday morning in Bloomington. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it seems like we are going to return to seasonal temperatures in the middle of next week. So no more 49-degree mornings like we had today. We're going to be in the low 80s from Wednesday through at least early next week. So Indiana State probably around 75, 74 at kickoff. That's a 6:30 kick on Friday. And if you're coming down for that game, I encourage you to go to see Indiana men's soccer take on Michigan on Saturday night. I'll be on the call for Big Ten Plus, so if you can't make it, then you can tune in and listen to me do play-by-play for soccer for the first time in 2 years. And I hope I can shake the rust off because broadcasting soccer is fun. And I think I need to give Todd Yeagley and his squad their flowers. I think I need to give them more than just flowers because they have been on an absolutely phenomenal run of form to start the season. Indiana men's soccer, really, it's just another year for Yeagley. I think his consistency at the helm of this program over the last 15-plus years, this is year 16 for him, his consistency has been unbelievable. It seems like every time you turn around, Indiana men's soccer is making noise on the national level again. And I think it's incredible what they've been able to do. Unbeaten through their first 5 matches are Yeagley's Hoosiers. They began the season with multiple come-from-behind performances. A 2-2 draw against number 9 Clemson in a game where Indiana trailed 2-0 at halftime. Yeagley said after that game he felt like the third goal, the game winner, was coming. They just ran out of time. But Indiana came from behind against a very talented Clemson team. Also came from behind against San Francisco, trailed 1-0 in the second minute against Green Bay, and then scored twice in 30 seconds in the second half to win that game. Dominated number 14 Oregon State just days later, and then took down number 15 St. Louis on Wednesday to close their 5-match homestand to begin the season. I mean, just unbelievable consistency and performance by Indiana, and it's a new-look team this year for Indiana men's soccer. If you know the names Sam Sarver, Tommy Mahalik, JT Harms, those guys are gone. All moving on to the professional ranks, some of the most accomplished athletes in a very storied program in Indiana men's soccer. But they've been replaced. I'm not going to say replaced because those guys are very difficult to replace. But Todd Yeagley has brought in some transfers to fill those roles, and the transfers are doing a phenomenal job. First off, we got to talk about the Butler transfer, Palmer Alt. Alt, a Noblesville native coming down from Central Indiana to South Central Indiana. Alt has been phenomenal to start the season. He's got 4 goals through 5 matches already, also an assist to his name. And alongside him, the Evansville transfer from Italy, Jacopo Fedrizzi. Fedrizzi with 3 goals and an assist through 5 matches. And also for Indiana, the junior from Ghana, Collins Oduro, who has been a fantastic part of this Indiana offense from the moment he stepped on campus in 2023. Michael Nessie, who came onto the scene last year, has also found goal, as has Easton Bogard, another young player for Indiana. But really, it doesn't matter who is on this Indiana roster. It seems like they're going to have firepower. They're going to have talent. And usually, for Todd Yeagley, it seems like his teams are a little bit more defensive-minded, but this team in Indiana has shown that they can score in a number of ways which was a problem at times in the past. Indiana would sometimes, in close matches, have more scoring opportunities than its opponents, but be on the wrong side of the scoring or find itself having to settle for a tie instead of a win, even if the Hoosiers, say, dominated possession and dominated the shot column in the box score. But again, box score watching is very, very bad practice when it comes to soccer because there is so much more than what meets the eye. But I can tell you, I was on the call for the game against Green Bay, watching some of those games on Big Ten Plus as well, and Indiana men's soccer is a serious College Cup contender this year. And I know you feel like you hear that every year because it's usually true, but Indiana's never, at least in my memory, which admittedly is relatively short in the context of Todd Yeagley's full career, but Indiana is rarely this hot this early on the pitch. Talking about Indiana men's soccer, off to a 4-0-1 start. 4 wins, no losses, and 1 tie. Indiana has won each of its last 4 matches and will take on Notre Dame in South Bend tonight at 7:30. First road match of the season. But Indiana's never been this hot this early in the season. Usually, Indiana gets off to a slow start. Now, part of that is that Todd Yeagley, like other coaches at Indiana, Jeff Mercer on the baseball side comes to mind, as does Shonda Stanton on the softball side. Indiana schedules tough non-conference opponents. I mean, you look at the schedule through 5 matches. Indiana has played 3 top 15 teams and has outscored them by 3 goals, keeping a pair of clean sheets against number 14 Oregon State and number 15 St. Louis. Indiana scored early in that match against St. Louis, and that was extremely surprising. Collins Oduro ripped a shot into the back of the net from the top of the 18-yard box. That was the first goal St. Louis had conceded all season long. It was very surprising. It was unexpected, and you knew at that moment that could have been the game winner, even though it was very early on. But Indiana is as hot to start a season as I can ever remember. And a big part of that, not just going to the offense and its ability to seemingly create opportunities out of nothing, but also Holden Brown, the Zionsville native, the transfer from Virginia, who is finally healthy in goal. Brown, in his second season at Indiana, but was behind JT Harms, the longtime Indiana keeper, last season after 4 solid campaigns, I should say, at Virginia. Holden Brown did not play last year, but Brown has started 4 games in net and has an .800 save percentage, a pair of clean sheets in back-to-back matches, and he's been phenomenal for Indiana in goal. Indiana's had some very, very good defensive moments, and Brown was named the Big Ten Keeper of the Week back on the 2nd. So that was 7 days ago, I should say. Actually, let me try again. 5 days ago. There we go. But Holden Brown, a veteran presence in net. Indiana trying to plug him in to replace JT Harms, who was that stable presence on the back line for a number of years. But Indiana seriously looks like a national championship contender in men's soccer, and it's incredible to see because you would think at some point Indiana might regress when it comes to soccer, just because it's difficult in any sport at any level to be that successful year over year over year. Usually you'll have an assistant coach get poached, you'll have players transfer out, or it'll just be the natural ebb and flow of talent. But Todd Yeagley says, no, that's not happening. Indiana men's soccer unbeaten through 5 matches, 4 of those wins. Indiana has not given up a goal since the 2nd minute of the Green Bay match back on August 28th. So that was 3 matches ago, and you're talking about Indiana holding opponents scoreless for the last 268 consecutive minutes. That's impressive. Notre Dame and Indiana always play each other close on the men's soccer side, always play thrilling matches, whether it's in the postseason or it's in the regular season. I seem to remember the first year I was involved with WIUX Sports soccer broadcast was 2023, and Indiana and Notre Dame played an absolute thriller of a match in that campaign. They tied 1-1, but it was very, very close throughout. As I remember, Notre Dame had a shot hit the crossbar as time expired, and Indiana was able to tightrope out of there with a draw against what was at the time a ranked Notre Dame side in the top 10. Eno Ento had a shot hit the crossbar in the final minute of regulation, and he was absolutely beside himself, as I remember. But that was a thrilling match to begin the 2023 season. That was a season where Indiana won 15 of its 19 matches. That campaign came to a close against Notre Dame in penalties, as Notre Dame locked up a berth to the College Cup. Penalties, Indiana's Achilles heel. I'm sure the Hoosiers are looking for a decisive win in South Bend tonight before they return home to take on Michigan. The Maize and Blue coming into town on Saturday the 13th. So that is in 6 days' time. I'll be on the call for that match on Big Ten Plus, and I will tell you that Indiana and Michigan, those teams have some recent history that I'm sure Indiana is not fond of, because Michigan knocked Indiana out of the Big Ten tournament last year. Somewhat puzzling, but really you can say puzzling about the entire Big Ten men's soccer tournament as a whole, not just for Indiana specifically, because it was played at SeatGeek Stadium in Illinois in front of seemingly no fans. Sure, there were probably some fans scattered throughout, but playing the whole tournament at SeatGeek Stadium in Bridgeview, Illinois, as opposed to campus sites where the higher seed hosts until the championship match and then the top seed hosts. Very questionable move by the Big Ten Conference, because that's part of what makes the Big Ten soccer tournament so fun. And it incentivizes you to push as hard as you can through conference play, because you have a chance, like Indiana did in 2023, to host the conference championship game, which is a huge advantage. As I recall, because I called that game for WIUX Sports, Indiana men's soccer having that home field advantage against a very talented Penn State team that had underachieved throughout the regular season and needed to win to make the NCAA tournament. Indiana having that home field advantage was huge. Absolutely huge. 5,000 people in Bill Armstrong Stadium for that match in the Big Ten title game. But the Big Ten Conference would rather, instead of rewarding the top seed, just play it at a neutral site where fans are a non-factor. It just doesn't make any sense to me. But not a lot of things make sense when it comes to the way the Big Ten does postseason play. Indiana men's soccer, though, I'm sure does not care about that. Give them a time and a place, they'll line up, and they'll probably beat you. 4-0-1 through their first 5 matches, and a date with in-state rival Notre Dame tonight at 7:30. You can find that match on ACC Network, as in the ACC Network, not streaming. It'll be broadcast on ACC Network, because they know, as I do as well, that this is a big, high-stakes match between two teams that have a lot of history against each other, especially in the postseason. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotacap with you. Talked in the last segment about Indiana soccer, but we'll shift back now to the other Indiana football, as in gridiron football, American football, which, ironically, for the most part, is not played with your feet. It's a discussion for another time, and I don't want to agree with British people on much, besides that Lewis Hamilton is probably the greatest Formula One driver of all time. Now, we need an American to get to Formula One, and I hope it's Colton Herta, but he's having to jump through all kinds of hoops to get there. Just like Indiana football is having to jump through all kinds of hoops to figure out how to get fans to stay for 4 quarters of a football game. Now, one of my classmates in the media school, actually, Colin McMahon, tweeted out a screenshot of an email that IU Athletics sent to ticket holders, and it went viral, which was kind of surprising. I think this is the wrong way for Indiana Athletics to do things. Indiana Athletics, earlier this week, this was back on September 4th, so just 3 days ago, sent an email to fans that said, remember the special atmosphere at Memorial Stadium a year ago. Big wins, big crowds, big moments, and big post-game celebrations. Let's make last year's memories this year's reality. We want to experience that over and over and over again. The email continues, but to make that happen, we need you to do your part. We need you to be a 4-quarter fan. We need you in your seat in the first quarter, the second quarter, etc. on Saturday. And Indiana, the Athletics continues in this email, show up early, don't arrive late because long lines and problems entering the stadium. Get there bright and early and stay for all 4 quarters. I feel like there are two sides to this, and I can see both of them. One is you're a top 25 football program coming off of a college football playoff berth. You should have no problem getting people into the stands. I don't know that many other college football playoff appearance or teams with college football playoff appearances have to ask their fans to come to their games and stay for all 4 quarters. But on the flip side, there is a much larger kind of mindset, I think, that leads to the attendance problems that you see at some IU football games. One is if the opponent is not a marquee name or a Big Ten opponent, then the fans are not going to show up in droves. Now, the official attendance yesterday was just north of 43,000, but that was probably tickets scanned because there were not 43,000 people there when the clock hit 0. There was maybe half that when the clock hit 0. It was hard to tell. I was on the field when the game ended, and it certainly did not look like there were even 30,000 people left. But I think for Indiana, you've still got a lot of fans who, and especially I think, actually I'm not going to blame the students because the students were there at kickoff. I think a lot of fans are still kind of in the mindset of, oh, well, we've never lost a tailgate, especially maybe some of the younger alumni. But I think for Indiana, you're going to see the attendance change when Illinois comes to town. Now, you're going to have some Illinois fans because it's not at all a long drive from Champaign to Bloomington. But I feel like as long as that game is remotely close going into the fourth quarter, you're going to see very few, if any, fans leave. I feel like that's a guarantee. But I know that we're going to have this same discussion next week because Indiana State, an FCS program, should be another blowout. And it's a Friday night. If you're a student, you want to maybe go to the game for a little bit and then go to the bars. I get it, although I've never gone bar hopping in Bloomington. Maybe I need to do that before I graduate. I just need to make sure it's not on a Saturday night. The students show up. It's just that they don't stay. And I think that's something that's been a case for as long as I've been a student at IU. I'm a senior. Usually the games were over by halftime, not in Indiana's favor, and that's a big part of why students left. It's tricky. But I think for Indiana, it's good that the expectations have changed so fast. It's good that Curt Cignetti has established this culture where it's clear that he and the athletic department are not okay with people leaving games early. I think that is a good thing because Cignetti has elevated the standards of the football team, and now trying to do so with the fan base, I think is a good thing. But at the same time, I think this is one of the products of Indiana not scheduling even remotely difficult non-conference opponents. I think that's just something that comes with the territory, and I don't know if that's going to change. I can't control the schedule. I just talk about what I see, and it's very clear to me that is a big part of why, because if you have a non-competitive game and it's a nice day outside, a lot of students are not going to want to stay. They're going to want to go elsewhere. There are a lot of parties in Bloomington, or maybe you've got family in town, you want to go get food or whatever, and the game is already in hand. But definitely a tricky situation for IU athletics. Now, the Indiana State game is a unique situation because Indiana and Purdue rotate hosting Indiana State every year. And basically, that is a big part of subsidizing Indiana State's athletic department for the year because, that's a situation where you pay the team to come to you so that you can play them. And I do think that for IU football, a final tune-up before Illinois is very important. Mentioned a few drops that took away some more completions from Fernando Mendoza. Also, the secondary, which is very thin. I wouldn't be surprised if Indiana has some freshmen on the field. Maybe we'll see the likes of Jalen Bell in there in the secondary. Also, maybe Dontre Henderson, a redshirt freshman. Amarian Knighton probably getting some playing time as well. That would not at all surprise me. And Indiana's going to need some secondary depth with Byron Baldwin missing yesterday and Bryson Bonds out for the season. So, moral of the story, do not be surprised if Indiana has terrible attendance again this Friday against Indiana State, but also know it's going to change once conference play hits, and really because there aren't that many home games left. Indiana only plays 7 this year as opposed to 8, and well, we're already through 2, so we're down to 5. And we'll be down to 4 at this time next week. I think you're going to see attendance much better for the final for the final home games of the season, all of which are against Big Ten opponents. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotacap with you, discoursing about all things Indiana football and attendance. But, it's another day that ends in Y, and I think that it's important to keep things in perspective about how 2 years ago, we just kind of accepted that people would leave football games before they ended, but now people are kind of pushing back and saying, hey, so maybe we need the fans for all 4 quarters. And I do think Illinois will be a very, very good litmus test for that, as will it be a very good litmus test for Indiana on the field. And I think that'll be very important because Illinois is, I'm not going to say the D word, daunting, but the Illini got off to a slow start yesterday against Duke, which I know, a team getting off to a slow start on the road in college football, that might be the least shocking thing of all time. That game between Illinois and Duke in Durham, North Carolina, was very close at halftime. It was not close at the end of the fourth quarter. The Blue Devils and Illini separated by just 1 point after the first 30 minutes of action. Illinois led 14-13. And then Duke made a series of mistakes in the second half of that game. Illinois won 45-19. Luke Altmaier, very efficient, much like Fernando Mendoza was yesterday. Altmaier, 296 yards and 3 touchdowns on 22 of 31 passing. 3 different players had rushing touchdowns for Illinois. Duke, on the other hand, 5 turnovers, including 1 muffed punt deep in its own end and a red zone fumble committed by Duke later on. There was also, and this is interesting. This is the kind of thing that good teams just flat out do not do. 2 players on the field wearing the same number at the same time on what should have been a punt following a 3-and-out for Illinois. Instead, Illinois goes down the field to score following that penalty, taking a 21-13 lead. So, yikes. Duke had a chance to be the architect of chaos and instead shot itself in the foot. That's something that Indiana absolutely cannot do against Illinois. And you're thinking Indiana won 56-9 yesterday. What could you possibly mean? Well, if you watched that game, if you were in the stadium watching it, you could tell Kennesaw State was taking big chunks out of Indiana's defense, especially when they went up tempo. Indiana got burned in the secondary, which we've talked about, a couple injuries, testing Indiana's depth, and that's going to be something to keep an eye on because injuries weren't a huge problem for Indiana last year, but absolutely something to keep an eye on as the season unfolds. Illinois is going to make you pay for busted coverages, missed assignments, defensive penalties. There were a couple pass interference penalties in there. Illinois is going to make you pay more than any of the 3 non-conference opponents you're going to see in Old Dominion, Kennesaw State, or coming up this Friday, Indiana State. So Indiana's got to make sure, and this sounds like coach speak, but it's important that if you're getting beaten, it's because you're getting beaten and not because you are beating yourself, not because you're making mistakes that you can avoid, that you can control. And that's what Coach Curt Cignetti preaches, is controlling what you can control. And whether you fail or succeed, to move on to the next play, because in football it's all about having a short-term memory, and really that's the case for any sport. Haven't really seen Indiana get rattled, though. Every time there's a mistake, Indiana seems to bounce back from it quickly, and that is encouraging to see. Curt Cignetti never satisfied. Never satisfied. He said he's relieved only when he gets up to his office and cracks open a beer, which I think is relatable for a lot of us. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotocap with you as Indiana is 2-0, as we kind of expected them to be. During the non-conference portion of the season, Mendoza leading the offense. That sounds like a South Florida law firm, but it's actually Indiana's quarterback tandem. Fernando and Alberto both completing touchdown passes, making them one of the first brother tandems, brother pairings, to complete touchdown passes in the same game. The first since at least 2015, although I'm not sure how far back the record keeping goes on that. I don't know if you can specifically search for brothers who have thrown a touchdown pass in the same college football game and get accurate results. I got to do some digging on that at some point. But in any case, Alberto Mendoza got some run yesterday for Indiana football, and he looked good. Very, very limited action, obviously. It was in the back half, really, of the fourth quarter that Alberto was on the field, but Fernando Mendoza was absolutely thrilled watching his younger brother complete a touchdown pass to Charlie Becker, sophomore wide receiver, who earlier in the game had a touchdown catch called back because of offensive pass interference. But Alberto Mendoza found Becker for the final scoring of the afternoon. Indiana's 8th touchdown of the game, 5 through the air and 3 on the ground, including one for Riley Nowakowski, the tight end playing as a fullback. So Indiana spreading the wealth around, but Fernando Mendoza very, very excited for his brother Alberto to get involved running the offense and ecstatic celebrating with him on the sideline. I'm sure that's got to be an incredibly cool feeling. Celebrating with your brother as both of you threw touchdown passes in the same game. Looking elsewhere around the country this week, a lot of chaos in week 2 of college football. And I'm sure that Curt Cignetti is glad Indiana was not involved in that chaos, because the same cannot be said for a number of ranked teams. And, you know, I know that we don't put that much stock in the AP poll, but it is important, if nothing else, for Indiana's college football playoff prospects, because every puzzling loss to an unranked team might potentially be the difference. For example, last year's Big 12 champion Arizona State upset in Starkville by Mississippi State. Mississippi State had a dreadful season last year, really in the doldrums in 2024. But the Bulldogs upset the Sun Devils yesterday, 24-20. Mississippi State storming the field. And you think about last year, Mississippi State won just 2 games against Eastern Kentucky and UMass. But Mississippi State losing every other game last year. So that is a huge win for Mississippi State. Arizona State was 12th ranked going into this week. I would venture to guess they'll probably drop to maybe 23rd or 24th. But Michigan not doing much to help the Big Ten yesterday, falling out Oklahoma 24-13. John Mateer, the Washington State transfer, very efficient, very productive, leading the Sooners offense. Justice Haynes, 19 carries, 125 yards, and a touchdown. Unfortunately for him, he did not have much help. Iowa did not help the Big Ten much either, falling to Iowa State in the Cyhawk game, 16-13. Seems like every time those two teams meet, they find a way to produce some of the sloppiest, most unwatchable football you'll ever see. But Iowa State, led by Rocco Becht, up to 3-0 on the season. The Cyclones faring much better during and after their trip to Ireland than their opponent, Kansas State. And oh boy, Kansas State. I think we need to have a serious conversation. Kansas State paid Army over $1 million to visit Manhattan and then lost, which I guess on one hand is patriotic, but one of the most intriguing games, if nothing else, just because of the way it was played. Kansas State, in that game, possessed the ball just 6 times. 6 times in the entire game. Army, and this is kind of Army's brand of football. This is one of my favorite things about Army. The Black Knights yesterday had a 14-play, 89-yard touchdown drive that took 7 minutes and 58 seconds. That's just stupid. And that's got to absolutely wreck you defensively, being on the field for that long, just getting ground down play after play after play until eventually you've got nothing left. And it's got to be so demoralizing, too, for Avery Johnson and the Kansas State offense, thinking, man, we just can't get back out on the field. Army also had a field goal drive of 7.5 minutes, a touchdown drive of 7:54. That's domination. And I think this speaks to the problem of preseason rankings, because you think back to last week, which is technically, I guess, week 1. Kansas State nearly lost at home to North Dakota, needing a late touchdown to win by 3 against North Dakota. Not North Dakota State, a perennial powerhouse at the FCS level. North Dakota. Kansas State was still ranked at the time, even though it felt, just by the eye test, that Kansas State did not deserve to be ranked after losing to Iowa State in the first game of the season in Ireland. But they were, and they nearly lost to North Dakota. So for that, Kansas State fell out of the top 25 and then lost at home to Army. Yikes. I don't know why any team in its right mind would ever agree to play in Ireland. Especially because if you're Kansas State, you don't get a bye. You've got to come back across the pond and play again next week, or a week later, I guess I should say. After playing a game in Ireland, and on top of being a college student, classes usually begin around the first week of the college football season. I wouldn't agree to that if I was running a football program. If I was Scott Dolson and Indiana gets contacted about playing in Ireland, not that I think that would ever happen, but if Indiana were to be in that situation where they'd have the opportunity, I doubt they would take it, and I wouldn't blame them one bit. Although as somebody who went to Cathedral High School, it might be cool. But a lot of chaos in the AP Top 25. 17th ranked SMU, who led by 14 points with less than 6 minutes left in the game, lost to Baylor in double overtime. 48-45, the Baylor Bears, going into Dallas and taking down SMU. You remember last year, SMU was a college football playoff team. So you've got 2 former playoff teams in the top 20, both being upset yesterday. And Florida was not a playoff team last year. But the consensus was that Florida was trending upward, and, Billy Napier's got some questions to answer now. Florida getting upset at home by USF on a last-second field goal. South Florida winning 18-16 in the Swamp. And this is all good for Indiana, because you combine those upset losses with the likes now of SMU, Arizona State. Michigan was obviously not an upset at all, but Clemson also playing very uninspired in the early going against Troy, trailing at halftime in that game. The moral of the story is Indiana is likely to move up. And you think big picture, in the context of the college football playoff, it's good that there was chaos in the top 25. It's also good that Indiana not only for the purpose of this week, but for the future, that Indiana looked much better this week. The offense looked more in sync. The front seven was getting pressure. And I say the front seven because the defensive backfield was poor at times, giving up explosive plays. And just by memory, it doesn't seem like Indiana gave up a lot of explosive plays last year. Now, I would qualify that by saying, of course, that Indiana giving up a 98-yard touchdown run to Jeremiah Love in the college football playoff game at Notre Dame was one of the biggest blows, not just in that game, but in the context of the season. And you also think about the Ohio State game. It seemed like there was explosive play after explosive play. One thing that comes to mind is a 25-yard completion on 3rd and 35. I think it was 25 yards. It might have been more than that. But as we know, that Ohio State team really made quick work of pretty much everyone that stood in its way. So it seems like Indiana has more to clean up on the defensive side than it did at this time last year. And I'm interested to see how Bryant Haynes and company adjust to that moving forward. And then, this is a situation where box score watching does not benefit you because, Kennesaw State only kicked 3 field goals. But Kennesaw State, you're gonna face offenses that are more efficient and more effective once they're down near the red zone. So definitely some kinks to iron out for Indiana. But if you're an Indiana fan, remember, things could always be worse. You could be the likes of SMU, losing to Baylor at home. You could be the likes of Iowa not ranked. But certainly I think it would help Indiana's resume if Iowa had won the Cy-Hawk game. But that would require the Iowa Hawkeyes to understand what a forward pass is. And it's amazing because Mark Gronowski, the South Dakota State transfer quarterback for Iowa, native of Naperville, Illinois, funnily enough, Gronowski was a very accomplished passer at South Dakota State. 2023, he threw for 3,000 yards. Last year, threw for 2,700 yards. Gronowski this year has thrown for 127 yards in 2 games. He's on pace for 762 passing yards in 2025. Gronowski also 76 rushing yards through 2 games, on pace for 456 rushing yards, which would be the second highest total of his career, but he's trended downward at every season running the football. So you're telling me, even though Iowa brings in a highly touted transfer quarterback, a lot of the fans were very excited about, it's more of the same. That's concerning. Indiana, I'm expecting that game at Iowa at Kinnick Stadium to be very difficult. You think back to 2021, it was a ranked matchup, Indiana and Iowa. Week 1, a lot of hype around Indiana football at that time. Michael Penix coming back after 2020, and it was 14-0 5 minutes in, and Iowa dominated that game. Okay, so Kinnick Stadium is a tough place to play. Now, that's still a few weeks down the road, but it would have helped Indiana if Iowa had scored more than 3 points in the second half against Iowa State. Iowa State only scored 3 points in the second half, but that field goal in the fourth quarter was the difference. Rocco Becht wasn't exactly great passing the football either. But I do think that if Iowa is going to continue to struggle to throw the football in 2025, then that Illinois game is really, really important. Not that it wasn't already, but you're looking in the context of resume-boosting wins. Indiana likely will have now 3 opportunities. Now, again, you don't want to overreact from 2 games, but it seems like Iowa is not going to be as good as I thought they would be. So you've got Illinois at home, and then you've got Oregon and Penn State both on the road. I think Indiana can go into Penn State and at least be competitive, if not win. Because Indiana, and I always point to this 2023 game, Indiana had a chance to beat Penn State in 2023 with a team that, as we now know, was far worse than the Indiana team that we have in 2025. Same quarterback for Penn State in Drew Aller, but he'll face a very different defense. I don't know about Oregon, because you think back to last year, Ohio State took on Oregon in Autzen Stadium. 2 very different teams, 2 veteran quarterbacks who are both now gone. But Ohio State needed everything to beat Oregon on the road, which is not surprising because Autzen Stadium is a very difficult place to play. That game taking place in just over a month. But first, Indiana's got to take care of business, obviously against Indiana State, but then against Illinois, because then you have an opportunity to potentially, and there's still a lot that has to go right, because you need to handle business against the opponents that you are supposed to beat. The UCLAs, by the way, UCLA, we need to have a talk, and we will have a talk later. But you need to handle business against the likes of UCLA, against Michigan State, against Wisconsin, against Purdue. You need to handle those games, of course. And I'm going into this with the understanding that Indiana is going to win those games. If you beat Oregon after beating Illinois, you're talking about potentially already having a spot in the college football playoff, assuming you handle business against the teams that you should beat. That would be a very, very good spot to be in. There's a lot that Indiana has to do to get there. But if Indiana can get to a spot where they beat Illinois, Iowa, and Oregon, well, I know that's a huge ask. A huge ask. Any of those games individually, sure. But all three of them back-to-back games, not back-to-back weeks, because Indiana has a bye going into Oregon, which is huge. But you're talking about a scenario where Indiana could have a playoff spot locked up without needing to beat Penn State. That would be fantastic. There is an avenue for Indiana to get there. There are some kinks that they still have to iron out, but it's certainly within the realm of possibility. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotocap with you. I want to give a special shout-out to one of my favorite albums of all time, Metallica's And Justice for All, which was released on this day 37 years ago. That was 1988. Metallica's first album after the death of Cliff Burton. They were very angry, and the sound reflected that. Still one of my favorite albums to listen to and play, although I put an asterisk next to the word play because there are some parts of that album which I can absolutely not play on the guitar. But there are some that I can, and I'm proud of that. So special shout-out to James Hetfield and company. Find someone who loves you as much as he loves saying the word yeah, or as much as we love talking all things IU and college sports. I want to get away a little bit from the AP poll, because the AP poll is bad and not fun and not cool, and I don't like it. I think it has some value, but very little. Very little relative to other more advanced metrics, one of which, the ESPN FPI, has seemingly course-corrected on Indiana a little bit. Indiana moving from 30th in the FPI, that being the Football Power Index, up to 16th. That is a 14-place jump. Other big movers in the FPI, Alabama now in the top 5. So I guess we just flushed the Florida State loss out of the system. Alabama routed UL Monroe 73-0 yesterday. Quarterback Ty Simpson setting a school record, 17 consecutive completions in an expected rout of ULM. So the top 5 in the FPI now. Oregon, which makes sense because the Ducks just absolutely walloped Oklahoma State yesterday. Oregon beating Oklahoma State 69-3. What's the point, Mike Gundy? What's the point of going all the way to Eugene just to kick a field goal, give up 69 points, and leave? That's that's a bad weekend. Bad weekend for the folks out of Stillwater. Texas is somehow above Ohio State. Gee, I wonder if those two teams met head-to-head to determine who was better. Those are the kinds of things about the FPI that seriously makes me think part of the calculation methodology is if the team is in the SEC, bump them up by a factor of 5. I don't know that Texas is better than Ohio State. I also don't think Alabama is the 4th best team in the country. But Indiana moving up to 16th, I think, is more in line with where they should be. I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't know why Indiana had fallen to 30th, other than just the FPI didn't like that Old Dominion hung in that game. I mean, it was technically a 1-score game, or it was a 2-score game at the end, obviously, but it was a lot closer than it should have been. I don't think anybody's going to argue with that. Old Dominion, though, did a lot of things right against NC Central yesterday. 54-6. Another explosive touchdown run. This time it was from running back Traquan Jones. 93 yards, a school record. So ODU, I'm telling you, maybe a team to look out for in the Sun Belt. And I think if Old Dominion ends up making noise in that conference, that's great for Indiana because it shows, okay, yeah, maybe Indiana played poorly, but also Old Dominion might have been better than people were expecting. So the Monarchs, a team to look out for this season if you're looking for Indiana's resume to improve just by virtue of having played against certain teams. Teams around Indiana in the Football Power Index include Missouri, a thrilling victory over Kansas yesterday. Utah, Texas A&M, LSU, now just one spot above Indiana. Indiana, and then just below the Hoosiers, BYU, Arkansas, TCU, and South Carolina. South Carolina, a very uninspired performance yesterday. Struggled for a little bit against South Carolina State. And kind of like South Carolina's game against Old Dominion, which Curt Cignetti talked about prior to that Week 1 matchup this year. South Carolina's offense, very laborious. Now, part of the reason, I'm sure, is that that game was delayed for more than 2 hours due to lightning. One of a few games that had lightning delays yesterday. But 2 punt return touchdowns for South Carolina's Vicari Swain. So you take 14 points off the board, and all of a sudden it's a 24-10 game, all else equal. South Carolina against SC State. So this is something to keep an eye on. South Carolina potentially on fraud watch. The Gamecocks, 253 yards of total offense against FCS South Carolina State. Lenoris Sellers, the highly touted South Carolina quarterback who some are calling a Heisman candidate, Lenoris Sellers began the game 6 incompletions on 8 pass attempts and was South Carolina's leading rusher until the final play. He had just 23 yards on the ground. Between the 2 punt return touchdowns and a defensive touchdown, South Carolina's offense found the end zone just twice. So that is very intriguing. That's another situation where the final score does not at all tell the story of the entire game. Sellers, just 128 yards through the air. And South Carolina's leading rusher, other than Sellers, had 30 yards on the ground against FCS South Carolina State. So that is why I say that Indiana beating Kennesaw State 56-9, although there are some things to clean up, it could be worse. Indiana had over 300 yards on the ground for the second consecutive game and had nearly 600 yards of total offense. 596 before a kneel down, which made it 593. Those are the kinds of things that you expect against a team like Kennesaw State, which is why I would say Indiana should be much more pleased, and they were, at least if the postgame pressers were anything to go by. They are much more pleased with the performance from yesterday, and they're trending in the right direction. But definitely some interesting things to look out for among teams that were looked upon before the season, and again, preseason polls create bias that trickles down throughout the year. But teams that were looked upon early in the season as being playoff contenders, having trouble. Absolutely having trouble. South Carolina falling 10 spots in the FPI is a reflection of that. Also a big dropper in the FPI was Florida, of course. You lose at home to USF. Yeah. And I do not envy... I mean, you talk about Indiana having a cupcake schedule. I disagree that Indiana's schedule is full of cupcakes because you have Illinois, Oregon, and Penn State. 2 of those on the road. Those are not cupcakes at all. Florida has the most brutal schedule, I think, of anyone in the country. They go on the road to LSU this weekend after, oh, by the way, losing to South Florida. They go on the road to number 3 LSU. They go on the road to number 5 Miami. They host number 7 Texas. They visit top 20 Texas A&M. They host number 4 Georgia. Go to number 20 Ole Miss and finish the season with back-to-back home games against Tennessee and Florida State. Now, this time last year, you would have scoffed at that Florida State game. But Florida State is much better than they were last year with DJ Uiagalelei at quarterback. It seems like Tommy Castellanos and Mike Norvell, they figured something out. I don't envy Billy Napier. It seems like Billy Napier might be sent out to pasture a la Tom Allen in 2023 at the conclusion of this Florida season, because people were talking about Florida before the season as potentially the first 4-loss team to make the college football playoff, because for some reason the committee seems to take a liking to quality losses and hypothetical games that Florida obviously would win. Now, the question I beg of Florida fans and Florida media members is, would Florida have won against USF in a hypothetical? Because if we don't value real results, then obviously the hypothetical probably has Florida winning, because the SEC, as we know, is the best thing since sliced bread. No participants in a national championship game in 3 years, but what do I know? So I would say Billy Napier, absolutely on the hot seat. But that is good for Indiana, because Florida potentially was looking like one of those kind of fringe CFP teams that would probably get an at-large bid if they did what they needed to do and at least showed some semblance of competence against good teams. But that is not at all what happened. Speaking of incompetence, I always love thinking about Big Ten football and mentioning UCLA. UCLA, of course, with former Indiana quarterbacks coach Tino Sunseri as its offensive coordinator, a loss that many people considered to be pretty big for Indiana after last season, because Sunseri mentored Curtis Rourke and Taven Jackson, both of whom started games last year. Jackson in the absence of Rourke in the middle of the season. Sunseri becoming the OC at UCLA, people were thinking, okay, this is the first test for Curt Cignetti. Well, it looks like Fernando Mendoza is doing what everybody knows he can do. Looked very good yesterday. The same cannot be said for Nico Iamaleava, Tino Sunseri, his offensive coordinator, and the UCLA Bruins. UCLA stinks. Flat out stinks. And I know UCLA was very unconvincing last year. Indiana went out to the Rose Bowl and did what turned out to be a very difficult thing, traveling multiple time zones in a conference game and winning. Not just winning, but dominating. I had the privilege of covering that game for IU Student Media. It was a blast. The Bruins yesterday faced off against UNLV and lost 30-23. Nico Iamaleava, the Tennessee transfer whose offseason was highly chronicled because of his NIL situation, his departure from Tennessee, his recruitment seemingly by everyone under the sun, only for him to end up at UCLA. This is a guy who was one of the highest rated quarterbacks in his class. And he stinks. He might just not be good. It's one thing for Nico to leave Tennessee because he thinks he can be better somewhere else. Tennessee fans, I think, are happy that he's gone, and that says a lot. Because generally, if one fan base is happy about your departure, that means that you probably aren't very good at what you do. You flipped it on the other side. Indiana basketball head coach Darren DeVries. West Virginia was very upset when DeVries was hired by Indiana. James Madison fans were very upset when Curt Cignetti was hired by Indiana. Tennessee fans were very happy that Nico Iamaleava left. It's also, if you mispronounce its name, it's Iamaleava. But, yeah, I'm sure he's gotten that 1,000 times. Nico throws a game-losing pick. UCLA, after scoring just 3 points in the first half, had a chance to go down the field and tie the game, but fell 30-23. UCLA, the lone winless team in the Big Ten, 0-2. Significant because UCLA comes to Bloomington in late October. That could potentially be a blowout in conference play. I do not feel bad for Nico Iamaleava because in this NIL era, you've got players getting money before they even play a snap, or in college basketball before they even step on the floor. So Nico, I'm sure, is crying and wiping his tears with $100 bills. But I'm sure it might sting a little bit to go from one of the most passionate fan bases in the country in Tennessee to going to Pasadena /Westwood/Los Angeles, where nobody cares about college football as it relates to UCLA, but especially not when you're terrible and you are not at all what people thought you would be. And oh, by the way, they paid you a bunch of money to run their offense. So Tino Sunseri, former Indiana quarterbacks coach, absolutely has his work cut out for him at UCLA if he's going to try to fix Nico Iamaleava before the Bruins come to Bloomington in October. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotacap with you. Thanks so much for tuning in. The second IU Sports Sunday show this school year feels late. I think the school year started a week later than normal. But excited to be back here in the WGCL studios. It's a short week for Indiana football this week. We will have some IU soccer to talk next week, just like we did earlier on in this show. And I think it's important because IU soccer has one of the better atmospheres of any sport on the IU campus, certainly the opposite of IU baseball. I can tell you that from experience. But I honestly would not be surprised if IU men's soccer ends up having a better atmosphere in its match against Michigan on Saturday night than football does against Indiana State, just by virtue of IU soccer being a Big Ten game. It seems like the established standard of excellence for Indiana men's soccer means that people are going to show up regardless of the opponent. And I think that's something that Indiana football can strive for. But I also think it's important to put it into perspective that at this time 2 years ago, Indiana had just played a very bad game against Ohio State in which they really couldn't move the ball, and fans were already fed up. And Curt Cignetti, you tip your hat to him for absolutely flipping the culture of IU football on its head, but at the same time, I think the greater general public, those of us who maybe aren't as active on social media, are more just casual fans of IU football, aren't going to be as quick to buy in and stay in the stadium for all four quarters against a team like Kennesaw State. That is what I would say is the one thing that's going to take time. It's people, are they going to see sustained success? That's something that only time will tell. Multiple years, long after I've graduated from IU in May of 2026. Now, Indiana wins a college football playoff game, then you might have a more compelling case. But also, again, no non-conference Power 4 opponent until 2030. Indiana buying out of the Virginia series did not help. Indiana buying out of Louisville, which I know was done under Tom Allen, did not help. You could have at least pointed to those games. And Louisville is a decent program. Virginia, iffy at best, but it would have helped. Certainly more of a draw, if nothing else, just because of name recognition, than Kennesaw State, who up until last year was an FCS team. Kennesaw State's upset over Liberty, one of the more puzzling games from last year. But you've got to schedule better opponents, and you've got to give it time. Those are the two big things, I think, for Indiana football as they look to increase attendance at non-conference home games. I understand bye games are a big part of college football. Indiana's far from the only team that played a cupcake opponent yesterday. Ohio State beat the brakes off Grambling in the least surprising result ever. Northwestern killed Western Illinois. Penn State shut out FIU, though that game was only 10-0 at halftime. I mean, the list goes on. And I know it's not at all a new thing. Minnesota took a page out of the Indiana playbook and beat a team 66-0, although it was Northwestern State, which I think speaks to how bad Purdue really was last year. After a slow start, Wisconsin takes down Middle Tennessee State 42-10. Want to give a special shout-out to Cathedral High School graduate Danny O'Neill for his performance in that game. O'Neill, 3 touchdown passes for the Badgers, and Luke Fickell. O'Neill running that offense after Billy Edwards Jr. was injured in the season opener. Excited to call that game when Indiana plays Wisconsin at Memorial Stadium in mid-November. But Curt Cignetti talking about yesterday how it's more difficult for him this year to establish the standard of excellence and the standard of hard work that he brought over with him from James Madison. He talked about it in the post-game press conference, said he was not at all pleased with Friday's walkthrough. The walkthrough where it seemed like players were sort of taking it for granted. He spoke about being sharp mentally, not being relaxed. And he talked about how when he came over from James Madison, sure, Indiana as a program had a lot of new guys, but a lot of those players knew the kind of expectations that Cignetti had for them. And now in year 2, you've got more guys transferring in from other programs having not been previously coached by Cignetti. It's harder for them to adapt as quickly, which I think could also be part of why Indiana struggled against Old Dominion. But you see Indiana settle in a little bit more yesterday. Still, again, some things to work on the defensive side. But Cignetti talked about leaving the first teamers in because, quote, we need to play football. We've got some games coming up. He's referencing Illinois and Iowa, where we've got to be able to play that many plays, talking about playing 4 full quarters and executing over a long period of time, being mentally sharp, not being relaxed, even if the game might be in hand, never being relieved on the sideline. And it seems like now in week 2, you've got a much bigger collective buy-in in that respect, which is always a good thing to see. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, it's a big day here on WGCL because the Indianapolis Colts take on the Miami Dolphins at 1 o'clock. We'll have you covered pregame beginning at noon. Matt Taylor will have the call. From Lucas Oil Stadium, the roof is open today, and I don't know if I should be excited that the Colts play football today. And I say this as a very cynical Colts fan who believes they have still not recovered from the retirement of Andrew Luck and the mangling of Luck that took place largely under the watch of former GM Ryan Grigson. Can Curt Cignetti coach the Colts on Sundays? Purely hypothetical. Can he do that? Can we just put him on a bus to Lucas Oil and have him coach the Colts today? Because I am at a point with the Indianapolis Colts. There are some, and again, it's way too early to talk about mock drafts, but there are some people who think that Fernando Mendoza could go to the Colts next year. Please don't. Don't even think about that because the Colts would find a way to ruin him too. They've already ruined Anthony Richardson, and the guy's only, 22, 23 years old? His confidence is shot. Somehow he won the starting job the last 2 years and lost it to Daniel Jones. Don't even get me started on that. But if Fernando Mendoza were to go to the Colts, they would find a way to ruin him. Curtis Rourke in San Francisco rehabbing his ACL injury, which, again, we didn't even know he had, but he played the entire 2024 season on it, which is animal behavior. But Indiana fans certainly glad that he did it. Indiana football does the Pro IU segment on the video board during one of the media timeouts in the second half of each home game, and they show all the IU football alumni who are on NFL rosters, among them Curtis Rourke, CJ West, Keyshawn Williams, and Miles Price, all of whom were, of course, a member of the 2024 team. Those 4 guys get by far, at least through 2 weeks, they get by far the loudest cheers of anybody. And Rourke had, I believe he got a standing ovation in week 1. Now, he did not, I think, in week 2, but mostly because there were fewer people in the stands by that point than there were at the same time in week 1. But Rourke getting more cheers than anyone I've ever seen on the video board during those segments, I think largely just because of the name recognition. A lot of IU fans probably remember the likes of Marcelino McCrary-Ball, who is now one of the captains for the New York Jets after being an undrafted free agent a few years back. Maybe they remember Nick Westbrook Akini at the time, just Nick Westbrook, who was with the Titans and is now with Miami, taking on the Colts. But those guys, members of Indiana football at a time where you had some talented players, but as a team it was largely very underwhelming or disappointing in creative and painful ways. But Indiana making waves in the pros. Miles Price is the Minnesota Vikings' first-team return specialist, both kickoffs and punt returns. So something to keep an eye on in Minneapolis throughout the season. Hoping all the best for him. He was a phenomenal wide receiver and punt returner last year. Hoping all the best for the alumni who were so crucial in year one under Curt Cignetti. That's going to do it for this week on IU Sports Sunday. The Colts right here at 1 o'clock. Pregame coverage beginning at noon as they take on the Miami Dolphins in what may be a battle of a stoppable force versus a movable object, but we'll see. Colts, it feels like, have not won a week one game since I was in grade school. Hopefully they can flip the script. The roof is open, maybe a good sign. But we will talk to you next week on IU Sports Sunday. I'm Nick Rotacap. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be right back at 8 a.m. next Sunday.